Hello, I'm going to be giving a series of videos about my sensation perception class in preparation for our test next Tuesday. The first topic we'll be talking about will be touch and pain. So you've got four things that you need to know about mechanoreceptors, and there's four mechanoreceptors. Um, there's the Merkel, which is disc-shaped. Here you can see the Merkel. It responds to pressure. Um, its receptive field is small, and its adaptation speed is slow. So if you think about how you feel when you get pressure on your hand, for example, um, it's pretty fine. You can generally tell pretty well where the pressure is, so that's a small receptive field. And as you take your finger off of your hand where you're pressuring it, you can also tell that it still feels like there's something there for like a solid second, probably. Uh, Disc-shaped, you're just going to have to memorize. Next, there's the Meissner corpuscle, which is a stack of flat cells that responds to touch, light touch, and flutters. Its receptive field is pretty small, and its adaptation speed is pretty quick. So if you think about light touch, it's going to be pretty fast. The receptive field has got to be small because you want to be able to tell the difference between like a light touch and a flutter, and you want to be able to know where those are. And if you think about like the 2-point test that we did in lab, the Meissner corpuscles are basically what that was testing, specifically where they were and how frequently you have them in your skin. Next, there's the Ruffini cylinder, which are these little clusters here. They're little branched fibers, and they deal with stretching. Their receptive fields are pretty large, and their adaptation speeds are pretty slow. So if you stretch out the skin on your back, for example, you can feel that there's still some sort of sensation there even after you let the stretch go back to where it was. The receptive field is pretty small because you don't really need fine sensation of stretching. You just need to know that like you are being stretched. Finally, there's the Pacinian corpuscle, which is onion-like. It responds to vibration. Its receptive field is quite large, and its adaptation speed is quite quick. So if you think about like having a toothbrush, an electric toothbrush in your mouth, and you're brushing your teeth, you can probably feel that pretty well along your body. But you maybe can't, like, if you were blind and somebody else was brushing your teeth with an electric toothbrush for some reason, you probably wouldn't feel it. You wouldn't be able to tell, or you would feel it, but you wouldn't be able to tell exactly where it was. And that's okay. That's fine. How does mechanoreceptor transduction work? Well, you've got this anchor, which are these receptors here. And these anchors, once they are activated, open up this ion channel, this sodium ion channel, which allows sodium to flood into the cell from the extracellular fluid. Touch and pain have two pathways. So touch, vibration, 2-point discrimination, and proprioception are all handled by the dorsal column medial limniscal pathway. So the cell that we were just talking about that just had its membrane depolarized because sodium flooded into it, that cell will then release neurotransmitters into the synapse between itself and its dorsal root axon, or this dorsal, well, it's a dorsal root axon, but it's releasing it onto the dendrite of the dorsal root. That signal gets transmitted up the dorsal column on the same side of your spinal column, or of your spinal cord, up until the dorsal column nuclei. And at the dorsal column nuclei, it switches over the midline to the other side of your spinal cord, switches to the other side in the medulla, at the medial limniscus. At the thalamus, it then transmits from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, specifically the somatosensory cortex, and probably a few other areas along the way. Pain, on the other hand, pain, temperature, some touch, and there's also pressure. Pressure specifically goes through the spinal thalamic pathway. Same thing. We've got this axon that has just been, or we have nociceptors, pain receptors that just got activated that allowed sodium to flood in using the same transduction method, and they just synapsed onto the dorsal root, and that's the difference is in the spinal thalamic pathway. We switch pretty low in the spinal cord, so before we get to the medulla. So we switch sides. So if you have a pain in your left hand, the signal will travel up your spinal cord on the right, through the spinal cord, through the medulla, all the way up until it gets to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it'll be transmitted into the cerebral cortex, the somatosensory cortex. So a couple other things that we need to talk about. So plasticity is this idea that the brain is able to replace itself and effectively rebuild itself. It can change its function pretty well. And this is kind of governed by 4 rules. Practice makes perfect is this idea that if you do something, if a given neuron, if a given series of neuron fires, the more you practice that thing, the more you do it, the more effective and more quick that series of neurons can go. That's actually more fire and wire together. Practice make perfect is more, I don't know, it seems pretty self-explanatory, but I'm having trouble bringing it into words. Use it or lose it is this idea that if you're not using a particular part of your cortex, it won't be practiced. So if you think about old people having really, really bad falls, well, they don't fall very often anymore. They're not used to falling, so their falls are a lot worse because they've lost the ability to safely fall. Finally, there's dream it to achieve it. And dream it to achieve it is this idea that you need to go through REM cycle sleep in order to basically solidify. It basically solidifies an action in your mind. One more thing on fire together, wire together. 2 neurons, if they fire together, they'll continue to fire together and they'll become better at firing together. That's the gist of that. Pain. Well, there's 3 kinds. There's acute, there's prolonged, and there's chronic pain. Acute is like if you stub your toe. It's instantaneous, doesn't last very long, and it'll discourage you from doing it again. Prolonged is when you're recovering. So if you break your arm, you break your leg, or something like that, you'll have pain for a couple hours, couple days, couple months at absolute worst, and then you'll eventually recover. That pain's there so that you do recover, so that you don't make it worse, so that you don't make your injury worse while you're still trying to recover. Chronic pain is stuff that happens with arthritis and neuropathy, and there's a lot of different diseases that can cause chronic pain. Chronic pain persists for months and years, and you can feel basically joint pain, or like whenever you move pain, or not moving at all pain. You just get kind of spontaneous pain that doesn't have any rhyme or reason, and that's not good. It's maladaptive. Other pain stuff, the more pain you have, the more brain areas are going to be recruited to respond to that pain. So if you stub your toe multiple times in a short period, that's going to continue to amp up in intensity because more brain areas are being recruited. Linked to that, the anterior cingulate cortex deals with the emotional response to pain, linking the limbic and logic portions of your brain in the parietal lobe. So what does that actually mean? Well, basically, the limbic system, or the somatosensory cortex, has a sensation of pain, tells the anterior cingulate cortex, hey, get an emotional response for this, get a logical response for this. That's basically what the anterior cingulate cortex does, to my meager understanding, as I am not an expert in this field. Top-down pain management. Here's a couple ways you can deal with your pain. Well, you can use distractions. So if you've ever been stabbed with a needle at a doctor's office and you don't like needles, well, they're probably talking to you to distract you from it. You can also use meditation and other cognitive strategies to exert your self-control over it. Fun fact, that actually releases opioids into your bloodstream, which sounds scary, but it's stuff like adrenaline. Adrenaline slash epinephrine is an opioid. As far as bottom-up pain management goes, these are our typical pain management stuff. You can use drugs, which might be morphine or something like that, or a drug that deals with inflammation, that sort of thing. Alternatively, you can apply pressure, and you apply pressure to wounds because one, it stops blood flow, so you might not bleed out. That's probably a good thing. But you also deal with like the spinothalamic pathway deals with both pain and pressure. So using that logic, if you're pressuring, you can't feel the pain. And that can be helpful for dealing with your pain, at least in the short term, but it's definitely not a long-term solution. Finally, there's this thing called the gate control theory, which is that different neurons will be giving different signals for either inhibiting or amplifying pain. And it's these opening and closing of these gates like that basically will determine how much pain you feel. So it's kind of a spectrum. And this occurs in the substantia gelatinosa. Finally, we've got cortical reorganization, which deals with basically it's how your brain rebuilds itself, or just changes itself as a function of its neuroplasticity. We can study it using activity imaging, or brain activity imaging software. So we can use functional MRIs, we can use MEGs, we can use PET scans, and we can use EEGs. And there's probably others too, quite a few others. The gist is that the more you use an area close to an unused area, the more that used area takes over the unused area. So here's an example that we talked about in class. Let's say I have my friend Joe. I just cut off Joe's arm. Well, Joe is actually feeling pretty lucky because even though I cut off his arm, he's no longer needing the area of his brain in the somatosensory cortex for his arm because he's not getting any signals from his arm. So areas that are close to the arm represented on the somatosensory cortex. So I'd have to look at a homunculus to figure out what exactly would be there. I'd imagine it'd probably be like this area, and probably something with your head. We'll probably get even more information. So let's say it's my cheek. My cheek would then take over the area for my arm. However, this can be bad in the case of phantom limb pain, because even though you don't have the limb there anymore, because other areas are other body parts are using that area of the brain, you still kind of think you're having something there, and that can come in the form of pain. This can also occur in strokes. And the final form of maladaptive reorganization we talked about in class is focal hand dystonia, which is basically when you use your hands too much, too frequently, too harshly, and it can cause you to lose the ability to use your hand and to control it. Basically, this tends to happen in only the most extreme cases. You probably don't need to worry about it unless you're a musician or a gamer or somebody else who uses their hands vigorously many hours a day consistently for years. So you're probably fine. Finally, in adulthood and childhood, younger people tend to have greater flexibility in cortical reorganization because they haven't been fully pruned yet in terms of their synapses. Proprioception is also a topic in this. I think it's only it's only one slide long, so we'll talk about it in this video. Proprioception tells us where we are in space. So we use Golgi tendon organs, which are mechanoreceptors in the joints that tell the brain how much pressure they're exerting, or how much force the muscles are exerting. And this travels through the medial lemniscal pathway. Those basically tell us how much force is being exerted on my joints. They kind of tell our body where it is in regards to itself. So you can kind of think of Golgi tendon organs are like body in regards to itself. The vestibular system is like body in regard to the world as we feel it. So our ear crystals kind of indicate the balance of the head. If you've ever suffered from vertigo, it's probably got to do with your ear crystals being screwed up. And this is monitored by the cerebellum. Finally, you've got the visual system. And generally speaking, you remember when we stood in class and tried to close our eyes and balance. It was really, really hard. That's because we get a lot of our proprioceptive information from our surroundings as we see them. So, obviously that's pretty important. Another way that the visual system is important is because of optic flow. And optic flow is basically as you move through an environment, the rate at which your environment changes around you, that is your optic flow, and it tells us where we are in regards to our surroundings. So Golgi tendon organs are body in regards to itself. The vestibular system is like head in regards to gravity, and the visual system is basically the body in regards to its surroundings as they see them. Well, I do hope that you enjoyed this video. And I hope it helps you study for the test. I know it helped me figure out a lot of the stuff. Let me know if there are any questions, and expect another video soon.